is covered by the general theme of eschatology. Now, in the Osirian rite of Egypt, we must expect to find a new concept of ultimates. And I suspect that this was the power and influence particularly responsible for the rise of this faith. In the cult of Osiris, we find, for example, the gradual rise of a powerful monotheistic principle. Now, it does not mean that Osiris was technically and actually, in Egyptian religious philosophy, the supreme deity. But by degrees, Osiris became the supremely important deity, the deity most necessary to man, the deity that held in its power and authority the ultimate of man. Also, the Osiris cult had other answers relating to problems that confronted ancient man and which he, to a measure, is still struggling with even today. And that is the problem of the immortality of the human soul. In the Osirian cult, immortality emerges. It emerges as a spiritual certainty. This, in a way, divides Egypt even from Greece. For immortality arose perhaps later in Greek thinking than it did in Egyptian thinking. The old Egyptians of, say, 1000 B.C. had no clear notion of immortality. They realized that something probably survived, but to them the answer was the ghost land. To the earliest Egyptian, with an instinct for survival, it seems to have been believed that the dead lived on in their tombs, and for that reason their worldly goods were buried with them so that they would have everything necessary for their pleasure and convenience. That there was a real sense of immortality as we conceive it today is doubtful prior to the rise of the Osirian cult. It was probably locally taught wherever this cult dominated before it became the principal faith of the empire. The rise of the Osirian cult may also have been strongly influenced by the brief but powerful spiritual impulse given by Akhenaton. This Pharaoh, living probably between 13 and 1400 B.C., certainly was a powerful monotheist. He was one who distinctly and definitely held the concept of one God. Apparently, Egypt at that time was not ready for him, and as a result, his monotheism did not have an endurance. It did survive, however, in mystical and religious groups, and seems to have finally contributed to the ultimate integration of the Osirian cult. So we have in the deity Osiris many of the attributes and aspects that we would normally associate with a supreme being. First of all, we have in him that which is one of the high marks of an ethical civilization, namely a good God. In this case, a good God is one in whom virtues exist that are beyond the common practice of the believers or followers of that God. In other words, Osiris was perhaps cast in the image of man, but he was better than man. He was not merely a stronger chief. He was a nobler ruler. Thus, in Egypt, we begin to clearly observe the rise of the concept of spiritual nobility. That is, the rise of the belief that man lives to become better than he is. This is quite an important point which we take for granted. but we cannot assume was present among ancient beliefs. Gradually also into the Osiris cult came another important element, probably derived partly from Akhenaten, partly from Syria, and partly from Persia. This was the belief that Osiris was not only the good god, but he was a god who loved his children. And furthermore, that men, mortals, humans, were the beloved children of this God, who now takes on the father attribute. He is no longer a God with slaves. He is a father with sons. Now this thought is still hard for some people to reconcile in true philosophic insight. We all claim to think this. But in our relationships with life and with religion, we are much more inclined still to think of deity as the autocrat. But in Egypt, the followers of the cult of Osiris began to think of him not only as the good God, but as the wise God, the kindly God, and most of all, in the rise of their religion, the forgiving God. Here, then, we have nearly all of the elements of a highly advanced theological system. We have a deity who emerges as a power, a universal power for good. That in the great struggle of the ages, this good must come to ultimate victory. We have the God of wisdom, in whose nature all mysteries are known, all secrets have their roots, all realizations and revelations originate. We have the deity who has a warm and continuing affection for his creation. And also, as we learn from the various magical manuscripts, the God who understands his creation, so that if men are weak or inadequate, this deity understands this. He is not the cold, stone-faced image against the temple wall. He is the searcher into the hearts of things. He is the fanner of breath in the soul. In addition to these things, this deity is constantly laboring for the ultimate perfection of man, or the rescuing of the world from a state of evil. Undoubtedly, the Egyptians strengthened their philosophy of sin by deriving a certain amount of borrowings from the Semitic people. They also strengthened their belief in the war between good and evil from the doctrines of the Persians. So we have now the good God, Osiris, wise and loving, but not all-powerful, who is locked in a bitter struggle with his own brother, Typhon, to destroy him. The struggle of good and evil for victory over the life of man. This is anthropomorphism, a belief which, of course, has been for centuries one of the dominant doctrines of the Christian faith. The struggle of good and evil. But now the eschatology in Egypt says good will vanquish evil. So legends, myths, and fables arose among these peoples, bearing upon the ultimate victory of good over evil. Now the next point that comes into the Egyptian consciousness of Osiris is that Osiris is the Lord of the underworld. Osiris is the sun at night. Osiris, therefore, is in some way an embodied deity, represented often, wrapped in the wrappings of a mummy, so that he appears to be a living head rising out of a dead body. He is therefore the symbol of life-death. He is the symbol of the material world or universe over which he rules, and of which he is the demiurgus or the sovereign power. Osiris now begins to be represented with his attributes which were to have a great effect upon the religions that followed after him. Standing or seated in his mummified form, wearing his plumed helmet that crowns to the north and south, Osiris also carries the symbolical ceremonial objects or instruments associated with his faith. These are, first, the flail. The flail, or the whip, was then used primarily not as a symbol of beating or scourging men, but as a symbol of the flailing of grain. It was used to divide the grain from the husk. Therefore, as the flailer, or the beater, Osiris represented the power that divides the false and true, divides the valuable from that which is not valuable, and also divides the soul from the body. The second instrument which he carries is the Anubis-headed staff, by which he is the patron of knowledge or learning, and carries with him the symbol of the faithful guide. Therefore, in this symbolism or this emblemism, Osiris becomes the patron of education, the patron of all knowledge, the patron of insight, the lord of arts and sciences, and he bestows his blessing upon knowledge. In other words, mathematics, astronomy, music, law, medicine, these are also phases of the Osirian cult. He is the Lord of all these things. He is the Lord of the quick and the dead. And by this authority, he governs minds. He governs and regulates peoples. He establishes laws. He sets up the machinery of the universe. Then by his third implement of sacred symbolism, the shepherd's crook, or crozier, Osiris emerges as the high priest, the good shepherd. He is the keeper of the flocks. He is the symbol, therefore, of the protector of the faith, a term which was later bestowed upon the royalties of Europe. He is now the shepherd of men. He is the guardian of the flocks of creation. The world is his sheepfold. He is the shepherd, and all creatures are the sheep. And he also becomes responsible for the lost sheep. And it is his labor and duty through his priests, who are his shepherds, to bring back the lost sheep to the fold. Now, this did not mean reconversion to anything in Egypt, because there was only within a certain province one faith, and all belonged to it. But it was rather to bring back the unbeliever from the evil of his ways, or if he had failed in his religious observances, to bring him back again to the concept of these observances. As I think I've told you before, I talked this over in New York several years ago with the ecumenical patriarch of the Eastern Church, who appears in his full robes and vestments as the head of the Eastern Orthodox Christian Church, carrying the symbols and insignia of Egypt. And he told me himself, he said, we all know in the Eastern Church that most of our symbolism, our symbolic instruments, our robes, our vestments, and many of our regulations and ceremonies are derived directly from the religion of the ancient Egyptians. Now, this goes a little further because the Osirian cult gradually unfolds other attributes that are important to us. For in the Osirian religion, the endless conflict between light and darkness, the struggle between Osiris and Typhon for the control of the world, results in the emergence in the Egyptian cult of the world hero. This is the world hero also of the Sigurd saga of the Nordic peoples. This is the great race of the Volsung, the race of the heroes of the world. In the Osirian cult, we have, therefore, the arising of the hero concept, in which this power, this eternal being, Osiris, in order to advance the redemption of men, projects himself into the mortal world, coming forth out of the shadows of Amentet, taking himself a flesh of body, and being revealed or made manifest through his own nature in the form of an only begotten Son. Therefore, in Egypt, Horus, the only begotten of the Father, the son of the widow, the most mysterious and immaculately conceived, born of Isis, who was overshadowed by the Holy Spirit of her own murdered husband, Osiris, gave Horus the power to bear witness to his own Father throughout all worlds. And in the Egyptian ritual, it is definitely stated that whoever has seen Osiris has seen his Son, and whoever has seen his Son has seen Osiris. For the Father is in the Son, and the Son is in the Father unto everlastingness. So the projection of Osiris himself comes forth to be the Redeemer of men in the form of Horus, the golden hawk. This golden hawk perhaps also derives from the idea of the phoenix. Horus not only becomes the avenger of his father, ultimately restoring the empire to his father, but he also becomes the intercessor, the one who, having taken flesh, having lived among men, and having known the sorrows and secret pains of men, asks that the Father will be patient of men, because he has sent his own Son among them to be like unto them. And Osiris nearly always heeds the voice of his Son. And when his Son asks or requests, the Father generally is symbolically represented as acceding to that request. Now this gives us a very strong foundation for the doctrine of redemption, which was certainly taking form in Egypt by the very earliest contacts between the Egyptians and the Latins. Now out of this comes also another important doctrine rising in the cult of Osiris, and that is the concept of intercession. Here we have now Osiris in his own proper right, and Osiris as the extension of himself in his own Son. His Son gradually becomes, therefore, the peacemaker, the Prince of Peace, to whom the Father will deny nothing. But Osiris now stands in another relationship to this projection of himself. Horus becomes the scapegoat, and in the rituals of the coming forth by day, if the soul which has sinned is in doubt of salvation, Horus steps forth and pleads with his father Osiris, saying, "Let the sins of this man come upon me. Let me be therefore the bearer of his sin. and in my name, and because I have accepted his sin, I ask that you shall forgive him. Now here we have intercession. We have also in this very same concept, as we find in the Egyptian ritual, by the transference of the virtues of Osiris to Horus, and the transference again of these virtues to his priests, who in turn transferred these virtues by their form of the Eucharist. We have rising in Egypt the doctrine of transubstantiation. Thus we now have in this people, and I would say it would be at least 1000 B.C., that this pattern took fairly integrated form, for it is present everywhere in the Theban recension of the Book of the Dead. We have now what might be termed a reasonably complete theology. We have the beginnings of ideas that were to gradually spread to all other parts of the world. And we begin to see how it would be inevitable that this type of thinking would also result in the rise of a mysticism. This is really the crux of our problem, because in the study of mysticism, we then come straight head-on into the problem of the Egyptian mysteries. And of course, as might be expected, our more materialistic manuscript, a rich and full and complete version of the book of the coming forth by day. Here we find the priest Ani pictured at the beginning of the scroll. But he has died. Therefore we find the inscription reading, Osiris, who was Ani. Now, this occurs frequently in the manuscript, or the reverse formula, Ani, who is Osiris. Thus we have an identification that is very important, namely that at death the soul of man becomes God. Now where would this have come from? There is only one possible answer that we have at the present time, and that would be Middle Asia. For here we would find that perhaps at the same time that we are concerned with, the idea that the Atman, or supreme power of the universe, existed in all things, and that the spirit or life in every living thing is God, and that when the body is removed, or being departs from the body, it is in one way or another hallowed or glorified. We know that the time of the Papyrus of Ani, therefore, that the soul or spiritual content within the nature of Ani was Osiris. That all souls passing out of the body were Osirified. That is, they became one with Osiris. They were restored again to him. Egyptian metaphysics seems to point out, therefore, that in a mysterious way, Osiris is the world soul. We have already mentioned that he was not the supreme deity, because he was the lord of the underworld. And this would be perfectly consistent with the idea of the world psyche being the lord of the mortal world. And that in the soul experience of living things, the souls of all separate beings are ultimately restored to the world soul. And that therefore Osiris is the shepherd of souls, and that the place of peace or of survival, representing either the paradise to come or the assembly of the initiates in this world, was properly denominated the sheepfold, or the place for the gathering of the sheep. So we have now This concept also is that in each human being there is an Osiris. That this Osiris, perhaps, therefore, can be compared to Paul's ecstatic utterance, that Christ is you, the hope of glory. This idea of the indwelling divinity is rather unique for its period in the doctrine of the Middle Egyptians. The next point that we find, again, in the eschatology of the situation, is the description of the world in which Osiris ruled. He ruled in a wonderful temple located in the other where, not here but somewhere else. He rules, therefore, in a temple beyond the common dimensions of our concept. This temple is, according to some reports, standing in the midst of the underworld, in the world of dreams, in the world of the subconsciousness of things. But it is this otherworldness in which it exists. This otherworldness to which all must come by the mystery of death, and the otherworldness from which all things came in the mystery of birth. So we now have a world and another world. And this one world that we see and in which we live and move and have our being is a kind of world of the diurnal sun, which is the light of the world. This otherworldness is the world of the nocturnal sun. And in Egyptian metaphysics, we begin to see that this other sun is the light within us, the soul light. That as surely as we are lighted outwardly by the sun, moon, and stars, so we are lighted inwardly by the sun which is Osiris. Now, Osiris is usually in the various manuscripts represented seated and enthroned upon a cube rock, or a perfect cube which symbolizes the world. Very often he wears attached to the rear of his robe the tail of a lion, which is an attribute associated with the Sphinx, which suggests the androgynous nature of the deity in Egyptian painting. His body is represented mummified. His hands, however, are free, holding the implements we have previously mentioned, and he is crowned. Not infrequently he is represented as black, sometimes, however, as red. With him are his sister wives, Isis and Nephthys. They're symbolic of the triad of the hierarchy, which at that time consisted of Osiris, Isis, and Nephthys, the great Osirian triad. The room in which he is seated is called the Hall of the Twin Truths, and it is boundaried at each end by a tall column, quite ornate. These two columns are the columns of the underworld, described in the Greek mystical literature. And these columns also are the columns of the porch of the temple of Solomon the king. And Osiris is therefore thrown between a black and a white column to symbolize life and death, light and darkness, reality and illusion. Osiris is furthermore thrown in a mentet, or in a menti. And a mentet is the paradise, or the paradisio of otherworldness. He is seated in a celestial, invisible, psychical equivalent of Egypt. In this otherworldness, the Elysian field, there is also a river Nile, flowing down slowly to the Mediterranean Sea. There is also the inundation of the Nile. And here the Egyptian in the other worldness is leading his plow through the muddy waters by the riverbank. Here in this other worldness are also birds singing in the rushes by the river. The papyrus plant blossoms in grandeur. And also there are lakes and streams. There are all the good things. Here men who have passed the test of life live in peace and prosperity and worship the great God. And this might seem a little primitive to some of us as a description of other worldness, but it is very much more primitive than a city with four walls, with a foundation of precious stones, and gates on each side. It is not so much different. It is only a problem of how far can we penetrate into the symbolism in either case. Are we talking about something desperately literal, or are we trying to understand a mystery, as in the mystery of the city four square set forth in the Revelation of St. John? So here in the underworld, in his city four square, sits the great deity, judge of the live and the dead. And here in the crypt beneath the Egyptian temple, the great rite of the opening of the mouth was performed. Well, we have to try to reconstruct, as we can, the circumstances that would lead up to the use of this ritual. We know that as set forth in the papyrus of Ani, that this must have been a strange and splendid thing. Restorations made in England at the British Museum have been able to piece together what might be termed the ritualistic content. We know that this particular ritual is dramatically suitable for theatrical production. We also know, as Professor Breasted told me in Chicago, that there are existing manuscripts, papyri, of the book of the coming forth by day, in which the prompters marked for action, and their exits and entrances are marked on the margins of the manuscript. There is no doubt it was a theatrical production. But the circumstances under which it was given, and why it was given, might still be subject to some thought. One parallel immediately suggests itself, whether it is in India, China, Egypt, Persia, Greece, or Rome. The ceremonies associated with death were always also associated with the initiation ritual. The rites for the initiation of candidates in the mystery were always rites associated with the mortuary procedure. The purpose of this was obvious to the reasonably well informed. The purpose of initiation was to carry the individual by consciousness from one world to another. This also was the inevitable function of death. Therefore, just as surely as man by initiation becomes aware of his own immortality, so by death he gains this awareness. He stands, as the Egyptian said, I am dead, yet I do not die. This is a discovery, the fact of which, apparently, is reserved for only two possible conditions. One is religious mysticism, and the other is death itself. So the mortuary ritual is always the initiation ritual. Now, when would such a ritual be used, and why? Two answers to this. First, it is quite conceivable that this pageantry would be literally portrayed in the case of the death of the pharaoh. In other words, the funerary processes in connection with the death, perhaps, of the pharaoh, or his queen, or perhaps some very high officer of the household. In the case of an exceptional or extraordinary person, the ritual might be either privately or publicly performed over the actual remains of the dead. Under such conditions, the ritual would then have to be modified, because it would not be and could not be expected that the actual corpse could